Hi, Ravi. This is Heather.
Hey, Heather, how are you?
Good. I'm going to step in as chat monitor in here because the volunteer bailed out. So
Oh, no.
I'll be here if you need me.
Okay, thank you so much. Yeah, I got some emails this morning from some people saying, please remove my name. I am no longer participating as a volunteer.
Oh, good to know. Did you pass that on to Federica?
I did not. I just told them thank you so much because it's been like a crazy morning since 4 a.m. this morning. So
Okay, I get that. No worries.
You know how it is. I mean, I literally do not know how we could have done this without you guys. Like, there was no way possible.
Well, I don't know how much I'm helping, but I'm doing my best. But yeah, the volunteer thing is crazy.
You definitely are. So what will happen, Heather, before participants jump in is, I think following this session, we'll make a call as to what's going to happen with our first session tomorrow morning, because it's going to be like 3:30 a.m. our time.
Gotcha.
So if Maribeth is still okay with punting that, then we are I'll make that change on the agenda and send it to you. So as soon as the session is over, I'll do that for you.
Okay, sounds fantastic.
Thank you so much, Heather.
Hello, guys.
Hi there.
Literally the fastest shower I've ever had in my life.
30 minutes, it's not a lot of time when you think about it, right?
Not only that, I've got my hair done and everything. Like, now I'm going to be held to that for the rest of my life by my family.
Remember that time when?
I know, who kept coming in during my panel discussion and taking things off my desk and waving at me, asking me if I wanted a drink.
You should have said yes, a GMT for each hand.
Sadly, it's only water. Hi, Sandy.
I thought the panel went well.
Did you think so?
Yeah. I mean, it's odd because it's like, you know, you're a fly on the wall looking at a private conversation almost, you know.
Yeah, I know, right? I was kind of thinking more people might turn their cameras on, but maybe they weren't allowed to.
I didn't even try. Yeah, I don't know. So
yeah.
I have a quick question though, based on that. You know, funding agencies, have they ever involved like you know, people say, oh yes, we've approached the organization, you know, either Inuit organization or communities and things like that. Have the funding agencies, do they check that when they're looking at, you know, grant applications?
That's a really good question. I doubt it, except they might check by actually getting an Indigenous organization to review the proposal.
And that was my second question was,
yeah.
you know, are the organizations involved in the vetting process?
I really think
not, why?
Yeah, I really think it depends on the agency.
Okay.
What do you think, Sandy?
Hi.
Hi.
You know, Noor just was on for a second and off. She'd have a good perspective in the US, but you know, National Science Foundation just advanced this proposal where people were strongly encouraged to partner with Indigenous organizations, and it actually created a lot of chaos. Because it was very kind of poorly planned in terms of like a lot of people hadn't done the preparatory work and were just cold calling these organizations for support letters. So that was an interesting lesson learned.
Yeah, yeah. So Ravi, are you on track to get us rolling here? Because I have to say, like, the half hour between the panel and now I used to clean up.
Yeah, it's okay, Ambi.
Okay.
Not a problem. So it's 2:01 and we have 7 participants. Should we give it maybe another 2 minutes? We've only got an hour and a half of this session.
I think so, because I got
Okay.
the sense that people were coming back, like Matt Druckenmiller and others.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, all right.
And this is your cross-cutting session, right?
It is.
Yeah.
It is officially stated as a cross-cutting session, Sandy.
So I'm just seeing this came across my dashboard here. Fairbanks emerging as a hotspot for coronavirus in Alaska. It's just
Not surprising.
no, it's going to be Fairbanks and Anchorage probably, right?
Yeah, it's currently Fairbanks, Anchorage, and Ketchikan.
Right.
I think Quebec City or Quebec, they have 800 cases, new cases as of today.
It's not good.
Only in Quebec City?
I saw Quebec between the 10 minutes that we just had after the panel was completed. Quebec.
Okay.
I stand corrected, however. All right, I think we will get started. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the second session of Working Group 2, focused on observing in support of adaptation and mitigation. For those that are new, we welcome you and look forward to your contributions. To our returning participants from earlier today, welcome back. Our dialogue this morning, or I should say earlier today, revolved around providing guidance on the process of assessing what are the most impactful EAVs while critically evaluating the potential societal benefits of that variable. And we also got to a discussion around the observations that would be necessary to achieve those societal benefits or those social benefits. We gave an overview of the SAON ROADS process and mentioned that one of the key goals of the summit is to help us find ways under the SAON ROADS umbrella to allow different observing initiatives and activities to better connect around the lens of well-defined requirements and shared societal benefits. Our breakout sessions or breakout discussions were extremely informative, and we'll get some summaries of our discussions and our conversations from our rapporteurs shortly. But we are pleased to have with us on the call Dr. Sandy Starkweather. In case you haven't seen it, Sandy's keynote, which is posted to the AOS2020 agenda.org website. I just put the link to the website in the chat box. But Sandy's keynote provided an excellent overview of the ROADS process and highlighted many of the principles and assumptions that we need to pay attention to. Sandy has graciously agreed to give us a presentation on SAON's roadmap Arctic Observing and Data Systems. And Sandy, I'm happy to pass it over to you at this point.
Okay, great. Thanks, Ravi. It would be helpful if I could just see a show of raised hands in the participant list about who got to see the keynote, because I don't want to hammer on the same points too much if I don't have to. And it's absolutely no problem if you haven't seen it. Don't worry about, certainly don't worry about that. Okay, so that gives me sort of a feel like what I've prepared today is really just a mini version, and hopefully we'll get people kind of oriented to the process, and some things I know it never hurts to hear twice. First, thanks for including me in your working group. I know your agenda time is precious, and hopefully this can help address some of your unanswered questions, or we can have a discussion, because what we're really trying to do, and are so grateful to the organizers of the Arctic Observing Summit for, is to get a better understanding of what's going to work and what's not going to work in what SAON's proposed under its ROADS process. So the authorship team is on this slide on the left-hand side of the, who drafted the original process between February and August. And you can see from some familiar names, we had included folks from ICC Canada and from global programs like the WMO and Group on Earth Observations, from our regional networks like Circumpolar Biodiversity Monitoring Program and Interact, and policy makers and program managers, in an attempt to make sure that we were kind of touching all the important bases. The ROADS process was reviewed between August and October, and by more than a dozen people, and then submitted as a white paper to the summit. And it's really at this summit where we're casting the broadest net for input into the process, to make sure that we're getting it right. So the keynote goes through all four of these questions about the ROADS process. For this kind of shortened presentation, I'm really going to focus on number 2, what makes up the ROADS process, and unpack some of the key elements a little bit more, and then talk about the involvement piece as well, beyond the Arctic Observing Summit. This is just a high-level summary of the why piece. And I'll just point out that the process is really took into consideration systemic issues at the global, local, and regional scales, systemic issues in the development of observing networks in particular. And so I'll use that kind of scale language quite a bit during this talk. So SAON, most of you probably know, is the Sustaining Arctic Observing Network process or initiative from the IPY. And I've been serving as SAON's chair since just a few months ago. In 2018, it released a decadal strategic plan supported by 3 different goals. The first was to create a roadmap to a well-integrated Arctic observing system, which is where we get the roadmap language from. The second goal relates to free and ethically open access to all data, which puts the D into ROADS, that it integrates the data systems as well. And then the last goal is about the sustainability of the observing system. And this really speaks to our audience for the ROADS process, that it's both to guide our collaborative strategies. So in a sense, it's for us to help us kind of find each other and come together around key collaborative opportunities. But of course, it's also for national programs, program managers, and science ministers to understand what's needed for investment. And so all 3 goals are integrated into the ROADS process. SAON got a leg up in its ROADS process when it undertook the development of this, this framework I'm showing here on the left, which is centered around Arctic societal benefit areas. So I recognize a couple names on the phone call from people who attended the workshop It was SAON was a partner, and so a convener, and so many of SAON's partners were represented at the workshop. And a couple of the pieces, you know, we have the UN Sustainable Development Goals, we've got other benefit frameworks. What this one did in particular is really helped us look through an Arctic lens, which is one of the critical things that we need to do in developing our observing system. So you see things like food security and socio-cultural services that you might not see in a global type of framework, but you also see things like fundamental understanding, which is really important when you realize the disproportionate involvement of the research community in Arctic observing compared to other parts of global observing networks. So we really need to have the researchers at the table in the network design for that reason. One of the benefits of this kind of framework is that it sets out to be holistic by design, to consider both the big picture, everything we would want to consider important, but it also recognizes that many of these benefit areas are linked to one another. So they're not independent from each other. Environmental quality is not independent from food security or human health. Weather and climate are not independent from disaster preparedness or infrastructure and operations. So I'll come back to how we see applying this inside the context of the ROADS process, but it was an important first step in getting us down the road. So 3 principles and assumptions that our task force set down to help really serve as what I would call critical success factors in this process. The first is that it must include funding for Indigenous peoples' equitable partnership and participation, active participation in the process. And where SAON has the sort of mandate to help reinforce this and make it an important part of the process, we will do so. So, you know, we really want to make sure that this can become a vehicle for knowledge co-production around observing systems. Second, it should complement and integrate existing approaches. So we recognize that a lot of the global networks, a lot of the large regional programs have already done a lot of their network planning. Some even work with essential variable concepts, which we'll talk about in a minute. It was not our intent to overwrite what they were doing, but rather to provide more of a light integrating layer at the sort of meta level across all these different programs where information could be shared. And last, we recognize that not every program is going to be ready to jump into the process. And we also kind of want to start small. We don't want to try to do everything at once. So we're looking at a flexible approach that can grow over time. And we hope that's reflected in some of the elements that I'm about to show you. So getting back to the societal benefit framework, one of the things that it supports and one of the things that we think is going to be critical in assessing high impact activities inside the ROADS process is value tree analysis. And so value tree analysis helps support that systems level view across all of those objectives that you're trying to meet and help you understand where certain things are paying multiple dividends, where you see the same observing system just being a workhorse inside the network, versus where you see maybe some gaps that need to be filled. And so I've just developed, I took the food security benefit area out of that specific report. I know the food security working group has developed different focal areas than what I'm showing here, but this is from the benefits report just for illustration purposes. So we know that applications, which you all are so wholly focused on, from assessments to public service warnings, but you could also think of key science questions. Those are sort of the fruits of what we're trying to do with our observing system. This is where we draw together the observational basis, synthesize it into usable products and services. And that sits on the other side often of what we're trying to accomplish from where the observing systems, the rudiments of the observing systems are found, which I've shown over here on the right-hand side. And the observing system inputs, we know that these feed forward into things like intermediate data products and services, which in and of themselves are not that usable to a lot of people, and they often kind of need some interfaces of their own. And what lies in between these more primary rudimentary data sets and the applications that we're looking for to support societal benefit is what's often called the valley of death. I show a lot of rich linkages here, but we know very often it's getting through this particular part of the translation process that's quite difficult. So one of the things, in addition to value tree analysis, that we're recommending in the ROADS process is to think about essential Arctic variables or essential Arctic phenomena or processes in serving as sort of a mediation structure in between the societally defined requirements on the one side and the needed observing and data system requirements on the other side. The global networks use essential variable frameworks quite effectively in planning their networks. It's a bit of a misnomer. They're not variables in the kind of classic measurement science sense. They're generally these very broad phenomenological categories. I'll show an example for sea ice in a moment. You know, clearly a very broad category. And that's why we've added the language processes or phenomena. That's probably more relevant language for the Arctic. So we, again, conceptually broad, and we recognize three important steps in the development of an essential Arctic variable. And the first is this, this idea that they should be assessed for their criticality, identified or backed out or assessed for their criticality for supporting Arctic societal benefit. And here SAON would like to see the bar be pretty high, because we don't really want a lengthy list of these planning tools. We want a short, we think we'll go further with a shorter and more high impact list of essential variables. They are defined by their observing system requirements, things like spatial scales, temporal scales, the timeliness of the information, where the information's being collected. And so here I'm showing the space and time scales of some of the key subvariables of sea ice, water masses, surface waves, things like that. And what you can see is in the global networks where this description comes from, that they're very often looking through the global climate lens when they define these variables. And the result is the observing system focuses on broader scales or less timely information than it might otherwise focus on if we were considering meeting more Arctic specific societal benefits. So here I've shown just a thought example of what adopting sea ice as an essential Arctic variable might entail. We'd be looking at whether we needed to refine the requirements to cover issues like coastal ice, shore fast ice. And then the last step we see in this essential variable development process is looking at implementation strategies. How do we thread together through the whole range of our observing capabilities a robust and affordable and sustainable plan for monitoring these variables and disseminating this data? So I'm showing an example of this kind of pyramid structure from the sea bonds, which is very suggestive of trying to integrate across all these different types of technology. So again, kind of building on the sea ice example, and this example comes from Hayo Aiken and Company, again, sort of a value tree representation. And it shows how one way we imagine that essential variables would get identified in the ROADS process is through examining the global variables that are already in place and identifying those that maybe were very poorly implemented in the Arctic, or that again aren't hitting as many societal benefits as they could. In this example, they've added coastal livelihoods, food security, and coastal protection on the sort of social requirement side of the value tree, which you can see leads to a different set of applications, a broader set of applications, and by necessity, a need to broaden out the definition of the sea ice variable. As I alluded to earlier, if you look at the observing network satellites, 2 satellites are shown in gray lines. That's more typical of what's supporting these broader scale variables. But if you look at the coastal ice berm or the landfast ice, then they're suggesting that you would start to draw in local observer networks through things like the AOK hub at the University of Alaska Fairbank, and also different kinds of data systems like ALOCA, the local knowledge network data system at the University of Colorado. So this is just an example. We haven't adopted, you guys are all in the process of thinking about these. A second example that I think is interesting comes from, has been sort of backed out of a project that Dr. Mark Cerez is leading, and that's rain on snow events. And this is a variable that's not been considered by the global systems, but is highly impactful in the Arctic on issues like food security, especially for things like reindeer herding, certainly ecosystem health, travel, infrastructure. And what I think is interesting in looking at this example of developing an essential variable approach to something that's regionally significant is here again, we see those same satellite products that we saw on the previous slide. Again, the passive microwave shows up, but also again, local observer networks show up as being critical to getting the right kinds of information that we want at the Arctic scales. So those are some of the what's, and I'm happy to talk about them more. But the how to get involved, of course, for most of you is starting at the Arctic Observing Summit, and it's in the form of charges to your respective working groups. And so for working group 2, I think I might have missed a couple of things that you're working on, but in particular, this assessing impactful Arctic essential variables is something that that I know you guys have already started looking at. The second ask to the working groups is, we know that this is going to generate a good deal of information, and we need to structure that information so that it's shareable, accessible, transparent to a lot of different people. And so when we think about structuring information from the data community, they use the word schema a lot as a term to describe how you structure information and share it in machine readable formats. We're also looking for recommendations about other systems that maybe already do this well that you think are good examples, or even the kinds of information that you think is vital to capture in the ROADS process that might not be captured in other kinds of global descriptions. 2 other things that we're working on in this process, and I'll oh, I don't think I have that slide with me, is we envision that, that the essential variables, 1 or more essential variables, will be taken up by different topical expert panels. And so some of the working groups are working on engagement strategies for what those expert panels should look like, which organizations should be included. And similarly, SAON itself is going to impanel an advisory group to oversee this process, to uphold our guiding principles throughout the process, and to make sure that there's good synergies between different groups that are working on this. So this is kind of the graphic breakdown of where various groups are working. And so I show your group as sort of being in that translation space on the societal benefit from the essential variable up to the societal benefit part of the diagram. And so I'll just leave you here with these points about where we envision the ROADS process is going to bring us, and really to underline that we will go further with a shorter list of essential variables that we collectively all agree are going to be the most impactful. Okay, so I'll stop there. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Sandy.
Yeah, thanks, Sandy.
And we are very lucky to have Sandy with us as we continue our discussions in terms of what constitutes an impactful EAV, the societal benefits of those variables. So please, if you have any questions for her, feel free to ask them now.
I must be getting really good at this because people
I
aren't
know.
walking
I was
away
about
with
to say that.
No, I think it was great, Sandy. I mean, when we had our little breakout group, one of the areas we struggled with was I wish we could put the slide back up. Can you
Oh, I
put
can
the
do
slide
that.
with the value tree?
Yeah.
I think the very last one. That, right. We sort of struggled a little bit with the applications. So I think this is a good explanation for us. I think, yeah, so we did an example that looked at healthy marine ecosystems and then kind of worked through it on a marine mammal sort of side of things, which really fits into food security, but in and of itself, it's also an SBE, right? Or an SBA. So I just think I know I was having a little difficulty with the applications piece, but I think this is pretty helpful. So.
Yeah, one thing I would say, having done a few of these value tree analyses for different groups, is that one person's application is another person's intermediate product, depending on who you are. That, some of these things kind of loop back and feed into each other sometimes in tricky ways. But what we found most helpful, we did a single day sea ice forecasting data products example, or observing system value tree example. And it was the things like the Alaska Sea Ice Program daily sea ice concentration product that became, sort of the product that we organized the value tree analysis around. And from there, you can do that expert elicitation to say, what's feeding into this? Like what are those intermediate products that we need in order to build up this bigger kind of final product?
Right.
Sandy, I had another question. This is Matt Druckenmiller.
Hi, Matt.
Hello. If I heard you correctly, you referred to the space between societal benefit areas and essential Arctic variables and processes as the translational space. And I'm just wondering, have you considered actually adding boundary organizations to these types of value trees, recognizing that in a similar fashion as an application or maybe even an input data set, that they are kind of an essential piece, or they could be an essential piece if you actually consider how the full value chain kind of operates in practice and serving a societal benefit. I mean, I guess the working groups in some sense are playing that role to some degree, but I think in others that there may be boundary organizations that are very specific to particular applications. And I just wonder if that's been considered.
Yeah, thanks, Matt. So under, that's why I have applications in quotes. Within that sort of more formalized SAON framework itself, the language is a little different. They say key products, services, or outcome groups. And I just found that language kind of left people behind a little bit, and that maybe applications was simpler. You certainly can add lots of different types of things into the value tree analysis, but you add a box because value is being added, right? And certainly boundary organizations do that. So if they're the intermediary between, you know, a big stream of data coming in and more value added products going out, that might make sense. But I think what's really critical in what I would say is in the essential variable approach, you can think of the essential variable as sort of a boundary object that where a lot of the planning discussions that communities that don't have boundary organizations can turn to. And we, you know, I think another kind of concept that people use a lot is communities of practice. And I think that the essential variable or process or phenomena maps well into a kind of like the who of who would work on this, to me is another word for a community of practice.
Hi, Sandy. This is Mike Brady.
Hi, Mike.
Hi. Thank you so much. This is terrific. And I love this slide that we're looking at, kind of, I guess, carrying on with this stakeholder-driven design approach. So I'm thinking back, I think it was like 2015 or so, there was a report on, you know, approaches to optimizing observing networks. Mm-hmm. And this stakeholder-driven approach was one among several. So I'm wondering if you're seeing, you know, clearly this this particular working group and this presentation and slide is kind of focused on that stakeholder-driven approach. Are you seeing a shift towards more stakeholder-driven approaches? You know, acknowledging that there are multiple approaches to optimizing the observing network. The topic this year, the prominent theme is actionable observing networks. I'm wondering if this is kind of just this moment, or are you seeing a shift towards this more user-centered approach to designing these observing networks? And then similarly, but somewhat separate question, these essential variables that are going to come out soon that you're working on, are these going to be expert-defined variables in the end? To what degree will they include and reflect the user perspectives? And is this an evolving process? Do we, once we get the essential variables, are we done? And we can just, you know, design the system, or will this be a continuous process? Thank you.
Sure, thanks. Okay, I'll try and hit everything on that list. So I do think there's been a shift towards more identifying greater user value in observing systems. And I would say that's reflected both at, I'm funded by NOAA, even though I sit at the University of Colorado. NOAA certainly has been tracking in that direction, but I think the Arctic Observing Summit has reflected the growing understanding of what kinds of practices are needed to support that. So I think in Arctic circles, that's been growing for a while. Your second question, I think, was related to the variables. And so I just want to clarify, SAON hasn't identified any variables yet. We're really looking to the summit to help us make sure that we've got our criteria right and that we are especially hearing from people who are better reflected by the societal benefit side of the framework than the observing system side of the framework in identifying which variables are going to be the most critical. And we do envision that being a flexible and evolving process. You know, SAON, I believe in the ROADS document, says if we identify 2 to 3 of these to work on in the next couple of years, that probably feels about right. And that we'd maybe add 2 or 3 variables every year or couple of years thereafter. In terms of the expertise on the expert panels, this is certainly something that we want to hear from people about, but again, in adopting sort of a community of practice type approach to how we would develop these variables, I think we have to have representatives of the different interest groups and parties who want to play a role or derive benefit from the observing system involved to make sure that the translation of societal requirements is done right, or the translation of user requirements is done right. And so yes, I think you'd have quite a dynamic group of expertise and practitioners working on these definitions.
Terrific, thank you. Can I ask a follow-up question?
Yes, I was
Okay.
just keeping an eye on the chat also.
Yep. So just last question. So sometimes many of the important stakeholders don't necessarily, they'll be reluctant to participate for a variety of reasons. One being competing, obligations. So what is your view on the need to be like proactive to ensure that you're getting a nice representative panel, especially on the user side? So to what degree do you do that kind of boundary work where you're going out there? This kind of cuts into more the outreach aspect of things, and I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Yeah, so this is a conversation that came up at the Indigenous Working Group during some of the preparatory Indigenous Food Security Working Group during some of the preparatory meetings, and I think when you talk about engagement, one of the things that group's talking a lot about is capacity to engage, that there's a willingness and an interest in engaging, but very often not a capacity. There's not enough people to cover all the bases. And that's one of the critical reasons why we want to pace ourselves in this process and not just jump out of the gates and say, here's 20 essential variables, let's set up 5 expert panels, and let's contact, a bunch of Indigenous organizations to get people to serve on these. We need to be more strategic than that with people's time in order to assure that we have strong engagement. And so I think pacing ourselves and taking our time to get it right is going to be part of that equation. There's right now there's a proposal that's hopefully about to be funded in the United States that has some funding to kind of pilot this process through the lens of food security. And that's reflected in some of the participants in Working Group 3 and Working Group 1. There's another proposal opportunity in Europe under the Horizon 2020. Where Europe has put quite a bit of money on the table to support SAON, and SAON has pointed to participation in the ROADS process as being how we'd like that support to come forward. And we envision that we've asked that group to work on identifying an additional maybe 2 or 3 essential variables. So hopefully with funded proposals doing the work, there's going to be more capacity, and with pacing ourselves.
Hello, Sandy. This is KK Davis. I have a question about Group 2, trying to zero in on our essential Arctic variables and keeping them narrowed to 2 or 3. How do you, in the SAON's process, approach more tangible EAVs as opposed to things that are less tangible and more long-term? Because there certainly is sort of a pecking order of EAVs, I guess you could say, as far as things that are right up front, like coastal erosion, for instance, and then things that are a much slower process along the lines of air pollution or maybe ocean acidification. And I'm just wondering if you have that sort of built into your structure somehow.
Yeah, thanks for the question. So that's exactly the kind of thinking that we want the different working groups to bring to our attention. So in the language for the charge to working groups, while we're interested in the groups thinking about and brainstorming and looking at ideas and candidates for essential variables, we're most interested in what you think the criteria are that should sit under that decision-making process. And I think what you just alluded to is the difference between things that are changing really urgently and rapidly, and that, you know, maybe we should elevate in the list of considerations those things that are changing quite rapidly, while kind of maintaining a hand on those things that we know are going to become quite problematic, but they're maybe not affecting people in, you know, this year, next year, 3 years kind of thing. Is that a bit what you're getting at?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yes. Yeah, so any thinking like that, I would love to see committed to your working group record. You know, I know that as important as the criteria we have for the selection process and the kind of methodologies that we have, whether it's value tree analysis or other types of methodologies, it's also going to be critical who's playing a role on the advisory board and how they weigh these kinds of issues as well.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for your question.
Any more questions for Sandy? Sandy, do you mind making this slide and by extension your PowerPoint presented today available to us?
Nope, not at all. And I think I might have even sent it to you earlier, but if I haven't, I'll make sure that you have it.
Okay, thank you so much.
Great, thank you guys.
All right, so if there are no more questions for Sandy, what we will do is go through a very quick recap of session 1, highlighting some of the major outcomes as we break out into our discussion rooms. So let me just bring up a summary of what we discussed this morning, and maybe I can ask Matt as well as Caitlin to intervene at any point. Just give me 1 second. My connection is really slow, so just give me 1 second, bear with me. Okay, so this morning from the presentations, like it says, we had very informative discussions and focused our discussions around those 3 questions that you see on the slide. So the first question was from the presentations that we all saw, what observing needs to be filled quickly or expanded to support scaling up of strategies for adaptation and mitigation during the next decade. At least in our working group, disaster risk reduction coupled with human health were identified as two areas where observing systems need to be expanded to support scaling up of strategies for adaptation and mitigation during the near term. There was also the feeling that there is generally a lack of well-defined linkages between observing and action. The second question was, what makes an impactful essential Arctic variable? How do you evaluate the most impactful Arctic variable? And KK just asked this question a short while ago. And as Sandy alluded, we're most interested in the criteria that sits under the decision-making process. But several people suggested that this is really dependent on the needs of the community, which differs from locale to locale. Initiatives need to be jointly developed in most cases, as researchers sometimes can be singularly focused, and the community is often divided on what their particular needs are. And we got to question number 3, how do you link these areas to societal good? In terms of, I guess, also looking at some of the most impactful variables, I believe it was Gabrielle that made the point that we've got to ask which variable can produce the results, or which variable can we produce the results for, and which EAV is also important societally. So Gabby suggested wind, for example, is a variable of high importance. Maybe I'll pass it over to Mary Beth to answer the last question. How do you link these areas of societal good? I took this from Matthew's summary. Mary Beth or Matthew, if you want to expand on what's on the slide.
Excuse me, you caught me having my lunch. We talked about, and Matthew brought this up earlier, Matt Druckenmiller, who's back online, about the need to have these boundary spanners or institutions and experts that could, sort of bridge, and we've had a fair bit of discussion about that here. I'm just going to go into my own notes for a second, Ravi, because I didn't have a chance to pull it together because I had to go do the panel right away. So hang on a second. We actually, maybe I'm not quite ready. Sorry, guys.
If Caitlin or Matt wants to share their screen,
yeah, that'd be good.
Well. Yeah.
Sorry, this is Caitlin. I'm having some connectivity issues. I'm not sure if it'll let me get it up there.
I found mine. So I could share my screen if you wanted.
Yeah, go
Okay,
for it.
Here it comes. Can you guys see that?
Yes.
Okay, let me just put it in full screen mode. Oh my God. Right, so what we did in our little group is we sort of worked through this model. We started with healthy marine ecosystems, but to address Ravi's question about bridging orgs, we talked about the variety of different kinds that could include community orgs, institutions, experts that should be put in various places in the value tree depending on, what you needed to have bridged. And then I just wanted to talk a little bit about the discussion we had around essential Arctic variables, which is that we tried to put this in the context of thinking about our working group, which is adaptation and mitigation. So we thought in general terms, an EAB should have relevance at a regional scale, but it should overlap with community priorities that can be scaled up. And my feeling, we had a little discussion about this, is that the EAB ought to be informative for more than one societal benefit area. it ought to, and there was some thought that it ought to lend itself to interdisciplinary observing, excuse me, different ways of knowing and different ways of knowing. So that's kind of where we landed. I haven't had a chance to put it into the question framework. Does Caitlin or Matt Air want to expand on that at all? Oh, sorry, guys.
There was also a conversation about the cross-cutting pan-Arcticness of the variables, so something that's relevant with the regional scale, but also the local scale, with priorities at all of those different scales as well. Just to reiterate that a little bit.
I don't have too much to add from what Ravi presented earlier. Just to say, we identified in terms of what makes an impactful EAV would be one that can be co-developed as well with any of the communities. And that's about all I've got to add extra.
Yeah, and I guess Finn also had a comment based on governance, and he says that governance based on evidence, shortening the process from observing to action. I'm not sure if Finn is on. Maybe he would want to expand on that, but I do not see him on. So, but yeah, that was his contribution.
So
I guess
go ahead, Rob.
No, I was about to suggest that we break out into our working groups, breakout sessions. What do you think, MB? Can you guys hear me?
I have you, Ravi. I can hear you.
Okay.
Me too. Sorry, I was on mute. I was just saying maybe we could just stay in this group. There's only a few of us, like
okay, that's
14.
fine.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay.
So Sandy, do you think we're like moving in the right direction?
I do, yeah. I mean, I'm sorry, I did have to step away for a second while you guys had those pieces up, but I do think that you're moving in the right direction. I think that I think it might be complicated. It might make things a little less complicated in your thinking to zero in more on. I mean, I think the idea of looking at boundary organizations is interesting, but I think it might, and it might be good shorthand, you know, for who should be engaged in expert panels. But ultimately, I think that that's maybe it could get too complicated in terms of the linkages. The other thing I wanted to note that I didn't really underscore earlier is that augmenting and enhancing the articulations inside of SAON's societal benefit area is also an approach we're really interested in people doing. We don't look at that as a static tool. So if you think things are missing from there, that's valuable feedback as well. And Mike Brady and I at a national level have had that conversation a couple of times. But also other tools can be used in place of that societal benefit framework if it really doesn't work for a particular essential variable. But no, I think you guys are on the right track.
So I would agree about the bridging. I mean, I think in setting up expert groups or whatever you want to call them, you need to have those kinds of people in those groups. And that might vary depending on what particular part of if we look at the whole value tree, what particular thing you're trying to tackle at any given point in time.
Yeah, agreed. And working group 5 and working group 3, as I said, they're working on this engagement strategy, which you guys could work on as well. It's one of the last slides in the slide deck that I sent to Ravi, which I don't show because it's it's maybe suggestive that we're going to be doing this big, broad, outreachy thing all at once, which we probably aren't going to do, but it does sort of, do you want me to share it for a second? Or he's got it, yeah. If you go down to the extra material at the end.
Sorry, Sandy, this was a screenshot.
Oh, okay. If you unshare, I'll share this again, and it's so. I mean, I think one of the things that's valuable about this diagram is it's kind of like a big picture thinking, like at the end of a 6 or 8 or 10 year long process, we probably won't have assembled all of these expert panels, but it's kind of good to think about what the big categories might be, and where some groups have already actually made quite a bit of progress, or which issues like litter and marine microplastics and ocean acidification are sort of the hot topics right now, and they might get this work done anyway. But as you'll see, like I think at the regional and local level in this engagement matrix, that would be a good place to put things like some of those boundary organizations you might be thinking about.
So now that we have this up on the screen, I'm looking at it and I'm seeing that I didn't really think about it when I watched your plenary, but these are pretty domain specific kinds of expert panels.
Right. So the expert panels is not a one-to-one mapping with essential variables.
What about societal benefit areas?
Or societal benefit areas, although
Okay.
there is a food security one listed, right. and that's to a large degree because of the US research networking proposal that's organized around food security. So yeah, I mean, I feel a caution in showing this to a group, because it's like, I think this is kind of the work that follows. I mean, it's certainly the work that follows identifying essential variables, but it's like we wanted to put a little bit of thinking in it ahead of time, because we were hearing from a lot of groups, in particular Copernicus, who you were hearing from earlier, and Antaros, saying, we already did a lot of essential variable work. The same with the Circumpolar Biodiversity Monitoring Program. Yeah. They call them their key ecosystem components, I believe.
No, they're focal ecosystem components.
Focal ecosystem components, but they were like, hey, we already identified them. And if that's the case, and that's why under biodiversity you see a check there, if that's the case, then that's kind of that, keep doing what you're doing. This is how SAON thinks of it, and this is how we might harvest this information from you when you're done. But we might not stand up our own expert panel on it. It's just kind of good to know who's working on it in terms of the lay of the land. Similarly, under integrated ocean, there's been a lot of talk about, rebooting the Arctic goose concept, in particular because of the initiation of the UN Decade on Sustainable Science for the Ocean. And so if that group, does get its legs under it and wants to do some work on extending the essential ocean variables in the Arctic, then great. We're kind of lined up to receive that. But it wouldn't necessarily initiate in the same way as for example, the Food Security Working Group coming forward and saying, these are 2 essential variables that we'd really like to work on. It'd be a little bit different.
Thanks. That's actually quite helpful in thinking about it. So
My dog decided to join me.
I see that. I don't think you should be worried about putting it out prematurely because it does, with a little explanation, it does help to think about, you know, how things would move forward in different ways.
Okay, good. Good to know.
Okay, back to you, Ravi.
Thanks, MB and Sandy. So one of the things that we need to complete is the final question on the discussion template. I know that our breakout group looked specifically at question 3, parts A and B, but maybe for the next 20 minutes or so, we can all, as an overall group, discuss C and D. So having evaluated what some of the most impactful Arctic variables are, how do we link these two areas of societal good? And maybe expand on those. Any thoughts?
Hi, this is Mike Brady. I think something you said earlier that someone that's not on the call mentioned, I think strikes me as particularly important, is governance aspects relating to actionability. So it seems like C, it's one thing to link, get a conceptual model, but it's quite another to act on and realize some of the benefits. So not sure how that fits in here, but I would certainly second that actionability as part of the criteria for selecting a variable to put resources into. So it probably doesn't answer any of your questions, but I just wanted to make sure that was part of this discussion, since that person that raised that point initially is not here.
Definitely. Thank you, Michael.
So we're looking for some generalities here, or to the specific examples that we worked up. Because.
Well, maybe we can choose a specific example of an essential Arctic variable that was defined by some working group. So for example, Gabrielle, she mentioned wind. Wind as a variable of high importance for aviation, for agriculture, for various reasons. How is that important societally?
So I think, this is Mike again, if I can just jump in. So clearly lots of applications, wind's an important input for lots of models. One that I am familiar with is erosion modeling. So the wind fetch, the wind kicks up the waves. And I think just helping end users get a little insight into the modeling process to understand that is, that particular variable wind is what allows scientists to deliver products that result in useful information like erosion estimates and projections. I think that is kind of easily understood, clearly well monitored, lots of wind stations, lots of other ways to estimate winds, lots of good data out there, and lots of work being done to bring that variable into bring it with other variables to develop models and products like erosion maps. So I think the fact that it's ubiquitous and has multiple uses, I think I'm not sure what useful models don't in some way incorporate wind. So maybe another criteria is the multiple uses out of that variable. So if you have one variable like wind fetch from sea ice to coastline distance, very hard to do and to create meaningful like spatial products like along a coastline, and potentially one use depending on how you define the sea ice edge, for example. 15% doesn't work for things like other uses, like knowing what the sea state would be like, that 50% sea ice threshold would be more useful in that case. So maybe thinking about the multiple uses, and then, you know, kind of using a business or cost benefit analysis perspective, saying what's the bigger bang for the buck. So wind variable has lots of potential variable value, because it feeds so many different models that are used to support a variety of multiple product lines.
Yes.
So now you've got me thinking about it in the context of adaptation and the observational data on wind and how that can be used for adaptation in the context of sustainable Arctic communities or healthy Arctic communities, which is really different than what you've been talking about, Mike, but is related to things like the development of alternative sources of energy, of which wind is potentially a pretty essential Arctic variable, right?
Mm-hmm.
Does that making sense to people? Because I would assume you'd still need a lot of the same kinds of observational data.
Yeah, you need to know where the wind is good and how much energy you can generate.
Yeah, yeah.
Same thing with, you know, what's the solar, you know, what's the solar potential?
Right.
And that's another, obviously, solar radiation is a critical variable. So these kind of foundational variables, I think it's going to be hard to get away from. And the thing is, it seems to me, you know, I'm not a physical scientist, although I do spend a lot of time in circles like this, learn a little bit. But there are these kind of foundational inputs that, you know, fortunately, the observations are sustained because they do kind of address kind of very basic research questions. I hope they're sustained. But when you get into a little bit more of the applied side, you constantly have to make that argument that these variables have use in society, and if you're not making it clear what the value is, what the product and the, you know, the impact on society is, it's gonna be very difficult to sustain. So I think, you know, my fear is that we just will focus on the same variables that have been kind of supported by the key research questions, you know, fundamental understanding, which is, of course, is important. But when you talk about actionable information, you might find that the variables are maybe more, or in addition to the existing variables that are already well monitored. And this is where, you know, I'd love to hear from others on views on, you know, what are the variables that are already, you know, more or less sustained, which are in threat, and maybe identifying, I think this is key, identifying which variables that are absolutely critical to both answering important science questions and providing kind of more tactical information for current information needs. So maybe thinking about, again, like a business case, what are the variables that just the scientists can't live without, and the end users, you know, managers monitoring erosion can't live without, and then making that argument that this is, you know, not just an essential variable to understand the system, but it's an essential variable that we can't live without to understand the system. And by the way, also, if we connect with the right users, we can give them some data and information in the process that serves more immediate needs. So using a multiple use lens.
Yeah, agreed, Mike. And Gabby did suggest that wind is very important societally in the Canadian North, especially in the Western Canadian Arctic. It's considered a variable of critical and high importance, as well as a variable that we can produce quick results for. So it's considered to be low-hanging fruit. So I guess several tangential themes to build out what do we consider to be the most impactful ones, why, and how can we link them to areas of societal good.
Is the wind variable, or, I mean, what are some of the essential variables that are threatened? So thinking about, you know, sustaining the network, should part of the criteria for defining essential variable be which are those that are threatened, or do we have, you know, do we need to defend monitoring wind? Are these threatened observations? So kind of a pragmatic, strategic approach.
And there's two ways to look at threatened, right? Like, are the observations threatened because there's no ability to sustain them? Or is the thing that you're actually wanting to observe threatened? So we were talking about, in our working group, about marine ecosystems and zooplankton, for example, phytoplankton, zooplankton in particularly, right? Like, are we monitoring them? Do we have enough observational data on them over the short or long term? And oh, by the way, we don't. And also they're threatened. So it's like a double whammy there, right? And I would consider, personally, I would consider zooplankton a pretty essential Arctic variable in terms of all of the things we're talking about linking to societal good, like healthy ecosystems or functioning ecosystems, food security, all of and related.
I think another interesting point can be if something like wind, for example, might be really well implemented for a single application. And I think, Mike, you were getting at this as well. When I was working with the SAON network, one of the things I thought was a really interesting use case was when we were working on bringing together our black carbon data sets. You know, when short-lived climate forcers were all the buzz, and we got really focused on making sure we had accurate estimates of, at least at the surface, the black carbon. I had done a survey of potential users for the information. And what I found was that that there was very high interest in the health community and very high interest in the climate community. But the climate community sort of was holding on to the reins of how the data was produced. And the climate community would throw out all the extreme events before they processed the data, because if there was an extreme event on a black carbon, surface black carbon monitor, it meant that they had had something that was highly localized, like a trash burning event at Tixie, or, you know, a ship going by Barrow, or, you know, something like that. And so, but the health community was highly interested in these extreme events because that's when health issues happen. And so in producing, it was the same monitoring system, but in producing the data set, they were basically truncating off half of their interested users. And I never did prevail on them to convince them to produce both data products. I mean, the raw data is available, but if you're not an expert, the raw data is very difficult to use. But issues like that, like I liked Mary Beth's connection with the wind, that like, okay, or your connection with the wind, like we might be using it for weather forecasting to do a handful of things, but are we doing as much with it as we could, which I would call sort of, you know, the underutilized observation versus the case of something like zooplankton, which might be just poorly implemented. Like we're just not monitoring it to the degree that we should be monitoring it. So those are really important criteria, both.
I think this comes back to the actionability. So taking a pragmatic approach. Which are the observations that we should act on to prioritize, and then which can we? What are the opportunities for demonstrating the value with some legwork, getting more users, getting the value add into user hands? So what are the, it ties in the comment made earlier, the need for boundary organizations. These are all this capacities, kind of intermediary capacities, really provide opportunities to open up those multiple uses and benefits. Olivia Lee, I think it was, and Hayoik and others, 2016 paper, I think made a really great point that there are these approaches to getting multiple uses out of these observing systems. Sometimes the observing systems are designed primarily for science, but doesn't mean that they necessarily need to be used just for that purpose. In the implementation phase, you can intervene through engagement with stakeholders, whether it be local operators, others, and maybe identify, hey, this is what the plans are for science observing. How does this relate to your needs, and what are some adjustments we can make to satisfy your needs? One being, keep the outlier, keep the extreme events for these black carbon observations because we need them. Oh, okay, great. Now we have more than one benefit, more than one use coming out. Although the observing happened primarily because of the science question, but through the process of engaging and making others aware of the planned observations, a use is identified that had nothing to do with the original design. Just pragmatic, what can be acted on, what are maybe brainstorming what particular variable could have lots of legs if you really socialize that with a variety of stakeholders, and maybe a variable like wind that's well supported, well established, serving lots of models. That is something that we know has legs, should be in the hands of other users. Just it's a matter of doing outreach and pulling them into the conversation, and then demonstrating the value and supporting those systems even more, those observing systems even more. So just a brain, I'm going on a tangent, but I think what I'm talking about is different ways of evaluating critical. So not variable, not just thinking about, which historically has been the dominating factors, what are the fundamental science questions, what are the most important critical science questions, but now we're getting into the societal impact. So you have to think about things like bang for buck, what's pragmatic, what's the best variable to focus on with an agenda to get good value out, realize more value out of those observations. I don't know if this contributes much to the question at hand, but that's what's on my mind.
No, I think it does, because I'm thinking back, and Sandy might remember some of the discussions when the search program was being developed, and the discussion around the observing piece, and are we just going to continue to observe the same old variables that we've always observed because that's what we observe, or are we going to think about it from a systems perspective and observe the things that maybe tell us the most about the system, and those might be different than the things that we've always observed. So it's kind of the opposite, or the other end of that stick, which is, are the variables that we want to observe telling us the most about how to support the societal benefit areas, like about the system that needs to be supported to support the societal benefit areas. Do you know what I mean? Like, is it?
Yeah, the system is the societal benefit areas.
Yeah, exactly. So like wind, I think, is a pretty obvious one. Maybe the zooplankton is not the right example. Maybe it's actually ocean chemistry for it. I don't know, right? But it has to, to my mind, the EAVs and the justification for either continuing to monitor or expanding the monitoring or observing has to speak to the understanding of the system and also supporting the SBAs. I'll stop now.
I think that's really on track, Maribeth. How do you, it kind of refers back to my question to Sandy earlier. As far as broadening your scope to make sure you're rather ahead of things, as opposed to just hyper-focusing on observations of a particular, something in particular. I mean, the way my brain works is with listening to each of your comments, I can only, I mean, I'm submerged in it right now, but I can only think of transboundary air pollution as being detrimental to the health of all of the above, with the feedback loop and the albedo reduction and on and on and on, ocean acidification. And so, yeah, this is, I think you guys are really onto something, and I don't have the expertise, of course, to narrow that, but I think that's making really good sense.
It's a little challenging proceeding piecewise. The value tree assessment methodology was used nationally here in the United States to do this giant civil earth observing assessment. And so they pulled together all these expert panels and did all this expert elicitation, and they had, I think, 10 just national societal benefit areas, and they went through every single earth observing system in the United States, and they figured out through products and services how it was linked to these societal benefit areas. And if you could do that, I mean, it's a huge endeavor, but if you can do that, then you do get that systems level view to see, okay, these are like, everybody's using this. It also revealed some really interesting hidden things. Like, one of the things that they didn't realize was the sort of #1 most utilized observing network in the United States that almost all of the societal benefit areas were heavily reliant on was the stream gauge network. And it's like the rinky-dink, you know, brown box in the woods when you're hiking stream gauge network. We're sending satellites up that we're not getting as much value out of. So in some ways, it's what SAON's proposing to do. It is potentially, but we're potentially going to lose the value of that big picture by jumping straight to essential variables, because not doing that full elicitation, there's a lot of hidden mysteries in there. You just don't know. But it would take such a long time to do, and there's such an urgency to planning the network. I'm not sure we can justify a 3-year-long study to do a process like that.
No, I totally see this angle just as well.
You have a quiet bunch, Mary Beth.
I think we're like, some of us are fried too, right?
Zoomed
Like,
out, yeah.
Totally.
Yeah.
I've been zoomed into a paste. But I feel like we kind of have circled around 3 SBAs. One is marine ecosystems or food security. Could go either way with that one and still have the same EAVs. The other one was the pollution example, which would be, I can't remember which SBA that would be tightly linked to. And what was the third? Your group, Ravi?
So we looked at pollution, human health, disaster reduction.
Okay.
Yeah, disaster risk reduction, coastal erosion. Those were the 4.
So I think one of the interesting things to do would be to, because you just want a few EAVs, right, Sandy?
Well,
I'm just, sorry,
yeah.
go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, I think we'd be interested in hearing what people think they should be, or what some interesting ones were and how you thought about them. Yeah.
So I guess I was thinking, if we had our SBEs, or if we're talking about health, I would be interested to see which EAVs cross-cut all 3 of those groups, like, or all 4.
Maribeth, are you referencing cross-cutting food security?
Yeah.
Okay.
If we had food security, what are those? Can you show me those things again, Ravi?
Sure.
Tired out is the word.
I am toast.
I'm sure.
It's coming. It's coming.
I know. So, okay, environmental quality, that air pollution example that was kind of being worked through speaks directly to that, right? That it also speaks to human health, right?
Yeah.
And climate and weather.
And climate and, yeah. We kind of did it walk through the marine ecosystems, which speaks to food security, which speaks to fundamental understanding, which speaks to human health, and processes. So I'm just wondering if we can't get some EAVs that speak to multiple SBAs. I feel like I'm talking in code, and then finish the exercise, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I see the environmental quality easily speaking to food security in many ways.
When do you guys convene again? Do you have time to do to have people each kind of champion one and do some offline work for when you reconvene?
Yes, actually, we do. Let me just bring up the schedule for tomorrow. I think even my computer is tired at this point. Okay, there we go. So I think we do have a lot to chew on that will serve as a catalyst for tomorrow's discussions, that we will focus on societal benefit areas. As you can see on that slide, we have 3 sessions listed for tomorrow, but we have made a slight change to one of these. For our first session tomorrow, several persons were unable to view the presentations from this morning. So we've made the decision to show the pre-recorded video of our session earlier this morning during that time slot, which, as it turns out, is 3:30 a.m. to 6 a.m. for many people. Session 2 is a 2.5-hour session, and that will likely be a discussion-heavy working meeting where we can expand on and focus on the SBAs most relevant to Working Group 2, as well as link those SBAs to specific requirements for measurements of the EAV. Sandy, I think you may have rescued us from having to engage in a discussion on a schema to structure collaboration, as based on one of your slides, that discussion seems to reside with Working Groups 1 and 4. Correct me if I'm wrong. I think.
Yep. No, I think that's a good thing for you guys to let go of.
Okay, wonderful. And then our third session tomorrow is a writing focused session. So we will have some deliverables based on our session 1630 to 1900 UTC that many people can engage in that writing session. And then for our final session on day 3, we will reconvene and develop recommendations for the entire process moving ahead. How does that sound, Maribeth?
Dynamite, sounds good. Yeah.
Ravi,
Thank you so much.
Questions on the chat. Number 1,
Oh.
What is an EAV? The acronym EAV, does anyone care to?
Essential Arctic Variable.
Okay. And then there's Karen also provided some of her input via the chat. So if anyone has any insights into that, I can read it if you would like, or you all can read it.
So Michael, I can send you a copy of the framework documents that Sandy has written, where she clearly outlines what the essential Arctic variable is. I can do that as soon as we come off the call.
Okay, thank you. And I may have seen it, I apologize, just at the moment, I got stuck with that acronym.
And Karen, we are glad to have you. Feel free to join us for the subsequent sessions that we have tomorrow and on Thursday. So Sandy, thank you so much for providing clarity to the ROADS process, the assumptions as well.
Thanks for that.
Yeah, of course. And I really appreciate all the work you guys are doing, and look forward to seeing more of the roll-ups.
That was a giant sigh. I know.
Which makes for a bad sigh.
No, I think it's good. And just people are free to go and lurk in the other working groups, right? Like it's no big deal.
Oh
Yes.
yeah, absolutely.
Yeah,
And,
yeah.
I mean, I would really underscore, like, you know, your group's the adaptation and mitigation group, and I think really bringing that, like, that lens to this conversation is going to be very important. You know, what those groups at that sort of end user interface tend to encounter more as difficulties or limitations in the observing network that you feel could be addressed through working in this fashion. I think would be, you know, I think you guys maybe can go off script a little bit and dive into some of those kinds of conversations. If identifying specific EAVs is not that useful for you, you know, that's.
Well, I think it is. Like I'm thinking now, I'm thinking more and more about my wind example, right? Like you kind of need the same sort of forecasting and observations so that if you're running a system off of a wind or a solar system, you need to be able to know, you know, what's going to happen in the next 24 hours, what's going to happen in the next week or so that you can plan to adapt to the changing circumstances on a daily basis. The energy load is available or not available, which is different than forecasting for ship travel. Important, or one day we hope will be equally important.
Right.
So
Okay,
Mike,
so sorry, Mike, you go.
now just thinking about, you know, adaptation specifically, so much of that is obviously on the social side. So I'm wondering if another useful approach would be to identify something that can be used as an indicator. I know things like open ice days, something that some piece of information, clearly that's a product and derived from observations, maybe multiple observations, but maybe focusing on the indicator that maybe not necessarily local, but regional and global policymakers, decision makers may use as kind of an indicator that something is changing. So open ice days, clearly very, really important. What is the window of opportunity for shipping? Storms, you know, as at the edges of the seasons, particularly in the fall, you're gonna get more storms. So what are those salient indicators that policymakers, decision makers look to potentially think, you know, we have to act on this change that's happening. So open sea ice days, that's one that comes to mind. It's hard not to keep coming back to sea ice when it comes to the Arctic. Clearly that's, I'm sure everyone's covering that in terms of identifying essential variables, but maybe just with the adaptation group focusing on a product that has relevancy, saliency for tipping off decision makers that are keeping an eye on some of the changes that are happening. So, you know, NOAA report cards, for example, what are some of the indicators that they look at closely and monitor regularly? So 2 more cents for you there. No specific variable for me, but just I'm thinking about ways to approach. I think adaptation is a strong social side, and I think there's potentially lots of value added in the AOS community if we can kind of incorporate that social science aspect, tying it obviously closely to observing systems for the environment.
Great, thanks for that, Mike. Does anyone have anything else to add before we sign off? We're about 4 minutes past. MB, any closing remarks?
Right, so let's send all the notes from the rapporteurs on. We'll turn them into something that is usable for our tasks tomorrow. we have some time to do that. We would just remind people there's a panel discussion coming up today at 10 p.m. in Calgary. I'm not sure what time it is wherever the rest of you guys are, but if you can tune in, great. If not, it'll be recorded. And then our posters, I think I'm not going to the posters because they're at 1 o'clock in the morning. But the posters are all available for people to look at. And then we will reconvene again at in person at 10:30 a.m. our time. So the first session in the middle of the night is just going to be a video, right? That people can watch. Yeah. That's all I've got.
All right. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks, Sandy. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, Sandy.
Bye-bye.
Thanks
Bye,
very
thank
much.
you.
Hi, y'all.
Hey, Caitlin.